Right now it's time for our first keynote. And as usual, I'll introduce the chair, and the chair will introduce the keynote. So we have here Mr. Ken McCluskey, soon to be the former vice president of the World Council, I guess. But until this afternoon, at least the vice president of the World Council. So please welcome Ken.
Okay, I'm pleased to have the opportunity this morning to introduce Ann Robinson, the professor of educational psychology and founding director of the Jody Mahoney Center for Gifted Education at the University of Arkansas, where she serves as the coordinator of graduate studies in gifted ed. Now, actually, I found myself on the horns of a dilemma here, for my wife informed me a few days ago that for this introduction, I had damned well better wear my shirt with buttons. Now, the other night, though, Anne said I should just be myself and wear my usual t-shirt. And I liked her very much for that. But after some sober thought, as you can see, my survival instinct took over, and I am here in full regalia. But anyway, that aside, Anne has been making very significant contributions to our field for a very long time now. And actually, even before taking up her appointment at university, she taught enrichment classes at the elementary school level. She taught English at high school. She's received many prestigious awards, including the Distinguished Scholar and Distinguished Service Awards from the National Association for Gifted Children. She secured more than $20 million in external funding, Javits and other grant sources, and 20 million isn't bad. Anne has been past president of NATC, former editor of Gifted Child Quarterly, and now an associate editor for Gifted and Talented International. So over the next few years, she'll be making some very significant contributions to the World Council. She has several books out, including her latest on Illuminating Lives, which is about biography. And Anne uses biography as a research method and a pedagogical tool, and has written guides for educators on how to use biography effectively in the classroom. But she's also written various evidence-based books on a recommended or best practice in gifted education, which in essence is today's topic. So in her writing and in person, Anne says very important things in interesting ways, as we're about to hear.
That's very sweet. I think he just looks splendid in that formal attire, don't you? Absolutely. Thank you, Ken. I always appreciate your gracious and extremely unique style of introduction, so I'm very appreciative. It's a pleasure to be with you here this morning in Denmark and at the World Council Conference, and to be able to have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you about the challenge of turning research into practice. Let me see, just a moment. I'd like to have my PowerPoint up. That would be a dandy idea. Oi, this is not my platform. There we go. I've had some thought-provoking opportunities over time to work on projects that link research and practice, and sometimes what I like to do is to turn the problem statement upside down and reversed to sort of consider it from all perspectives. So out of curiosity this morning, how many folks in the hall here work in a K-12 or K-13 environment. So you're working directly with children in some way. You're actually in the building with them. Yeah. All right. And so thank you very much. And so by process of elimination then, we've got a healthy number of university researchers and et cetera in the room. So this is a stage. And to borrow the metaphor from theater, we have actors from both the world of practice and actors from the world of research. So that ought to provide some adequate tension for an interesting drama this morning, I hope. So one of the things I'd like to do is I'm going to try to accomplish two things. Well, not the usual three that we see in gifted education. I'm just going to settle for two in our time this morning. So first, let me indulge just a little bit to talk theoretically about the domain of best practices, because I'd like to lay the groundwork for the conditions that are necessary for us as a field, researcher and practitioner alike, to anoint a practice as best. So, for example, a key feature of any educational practice, any individual practice, and its research support is that they're not easily defined boundaries, these practices. So it might be more useful for us to think about practices as being along a continuum and being supported by different kinds of evidence, if that will be helpful. So imagine practices arranged along a continuum, defined by the kind and the amount of evidence that supports, or in some case, disconfirms any practice. Does that seem sensible? Because what happens here is the continuum helps you to understand the level of confidence we can have in any of the practices we want to be discussing. And so what happens, it will contribute to the discussion on the relationship between research and practice, which is actually, after all, the theme of this conference. So it will provide a more nuanced understanding of the research practice, or I'd like to flip that maybe, the practice-research gap, okay? Let me take a look here and say, if you think about it this morning after having had a good stiff cup of coffee, the gap between researchers and practitioners seems not like a gap, but rather like an abyss. And we're provided with a really great setting here in the concert hall. We've got the stage. So I want you to visualize a teacher. I don't have my hand puppets with me, so we've got to visualize. Visualize a teacher, visualize a researcher, and the imaginary dialogue might go something like this. Researcher: our research just isn't used by teachers or counselors or administrators. Aren't they reading it? Surely. We've published in practitioner-friendly journals. We've put our findings out digitally. We've even tweeted in trying to communicate the results of a regression analysis in a tweet is extremely difficult. What more can we do? Teacher: I really wish researchers would investigate the practical issues that affect my students and, frankly, my life in the classroom or counselor's office or head's office. I'm reading whenever I have a spare minute, but the research is too far removed from what I do day to day, or it's too vague for me to be able to figure out what to specifically do, and at the end of the day, I just simply don't have the energy. So that's an imaginary conversation. I know that none of you would ever take that approach, but really, the pathway between research and practice runs neither straightforwardly nor in one direction. It really does not. So we've made great strides in developing collaborative relationships. We heard Margaret Sutherland talk passionately about that between teachers and researchers. We've established inquiry teams with both academics and teachers and principals, well represented on those. I mean, you can look at the program and see that we've got several team efforts here. And we've done a good job, I think, of listening to one another. But the truth of it is that translating research into practice, or vice versa, takes time and tolerance, and you need tools to make the collaboration work. You need tools to narrow the gap, and you need tools to understand the complex relationship between research and practice. So, one of these tools is the concept of best practice, right? And that, in fact, this morning, the keynote poses that question. What makes a practice best? How do you get a best practice gold medal? How do you acquire a blue ribbon, as this lovely equestrian has done? Well, I'll tell you what. A best practice requires at least 3 features. First, it's got to have a clear description in the shared literature. Second, it's got to have sufficient evidence, however we've decided to define evidence, to support the practice. And third, and I think this is a really important one, the evidence must be convincing to the educational community who has to implement the practice, and it has to be convincing indeed to the community of policymakers who will ultimately fund it, because policy is about where you send resources. So that's a pretty tall order for a best practice, I think. So let's go back to that continuum. This graphic, it's a pyramid, sort of captures the kinds of practices you encounter in education and in the social sciences. And what I like to do, this is the first part of what I like to accomplish, is to describe each of the 3 kinds of practice and then to provide an example of each along this continuum from recommended to the top of that pyramid, evidence-based. And so I'm going to begin with recommended practices, because this concept of practice is a way of thinking about the frontline educator, not as an end user of research, but as a critical referent or guide. So what happens here is that a recommended practice, or this concept of recommended practices, allows all of us to enter this sort of noisy, and it is noisy, it's a noisy world of advice and exhortation and almost religious fervor that teachers and administrators in schools hear every single day of their working lives. Every single day. Would you agree with that? If you've just got a break from a classroom to come to a conference. So, recommended practices really are the received wisdom of a field, and I want to give the human story again behind this. In the 1990s, Bruce Shore of McGill University, Montreal, Canada, he was an active member of the World Council for many years, productive researcher, and a former math teacher. He decided to take on the question of what we actually thought we were doing in the field of gifted education. And he conceived of a project that identified what advice was given about what to do with talented children. So at that time, the term best practice was actually not much used. And certainly the term evidence-based practice had yet to make it outside the doctor's office because it came from medicine. But Bruce wanted to understand what our field thought it should be doing, and he wondered whether the advice that educators were getting was supported by research or not. Because we've all probably been giving advice to one another all week here, and so it's quite common to do that. And what you want to do now then is think about a recommended practice as an inductive way of looking at what happens or what should happen in schools. So it's not deductive, and let me just take a moment here because we're not going to get into the philosophy of science, but just let me talk about how you shift your perspective. So a recommended practice is not deductive. It's not top down from theory to research, to practice. It's not that. Rather, it begins with what educators encounter first when they serve talented students in the real world of classrooms and schools. So when a teacher arrives at the school door and starts to begin his or her year, the principal or the head says, "Oh, by the way, I'd like you to provide some appropriate services to our most advanced students." So what are teachers to do if they're confronted with that advice? Because that's what practices are about. Whatever level of practices, it's about what are you doing. So what are teachers to do? Trust their intuition? I think we all have pretty good intuition. Ask a colleague, hey, that's not a bad strategy. Take a university course. All of us in higher education would love to have that happen. But however they do it, educators will encounter what's called received wisdom of the field embodied as recommended practice. And there's Bruce. I don't think Bruce is holding up a recommended practice there, but I wanted you to see the man behind what I think was a very clever idea. There's a lot of wisdom there, shall we say, and a lot of practice. So what is a recommended practice? Well, it's advice. Just pure and simple, it's advice. And we've been giving advice to one another, as I said, so one place to find these recommended practices would probably be among the group here. We happened, for the project that Bruce conceived and I worked on, we found recommended practices by examining about 100 textbooks in gifted education from various countries and cultures, although largely those that were available to us in English and French. And we found about 101 recommended practice. 100, that's a noisy world, 101 things to be told to do. We sometimes call them the 101 damnations. But practices will be crafted like this. You'll recognize them because we're all educators. Do this, don't do that, or you should be doing that, okay? So they're always crafted like statements in that way. They'll represent a certain level of agreement in the field. They won't be like standards where you can embody them, but they won't be anybody's single wild idea either. And they'll be broad enough to be generic usually if they're going to be helpful. Let me give you an idea. Here's a recommended practice. Base identification on multiple criteria. It's commonly voiced. Or here's another one. Arts, here we are in a town that just lives and breathes arts, so I had to use this example. Arts should be included in the curriculum for talented youth. So we're given a directive, right? But the practice doesn't specify which arts, when they should be introduced, how the arts would be delivered to children and adolescents, and whether a generalist or a specialist teacher would be doing them, or how they would be funded, if they would be funded at all. So get an idea there what the level of specificity of some of these practices might be. So finally, one of the most important features of a recommended practice is that someone recommends it, but as we looked at it, as our team looked at it, we didn't endorse it, and it wasn't necessarily supported by research evidence. So indeed, one of our main purposes for thinking about recommended practices and coming at it that way was to establish the credibility, or the lack of credibility, which is equally as important, about the advice given on specific practices. We sought to gain agreement. And we had some categories we tried to agree on. Some of them will look kind of familiar to you. Was the practice strongly supported? Well, we had some of those, about 7% out of the 101 damnations. Somewhat supported, about 34% at the time, and that's about, a third, a little over a third. Some are contested by researchers. They will be supported by some studies and disconfirmed by others, so they are contested ground. About 10%, so that would, we got 10% troublemakers in the group. Sadly, about 30%, 34% of the practices just didn't have enough evidence to know one way or another. Sounded like good advice? No evidence of any sort. And then some advice, we also had a category that the evidence, there was some evidence that the practice was positive, was workable, and it was generally appropriate for all children. That's about 15% or so at the time. I think it would be increased now if we looked again at that particular category of advice. And then finally we had evidence that things were inappropriate or strongly refuted. Don't stay up nights worrying about that. That was together very minor. Only 2 or 3 practices fell into those categories. So we aren't engaging in malpractice. We just have sort of insufficiently validated practice. Recommended practices are hugely useful in 2 ways. See, I said I'd keep to 2s. Oops, wait. Actually, I think they might be useful in 3 ways. Here's the first one. They privilege the practitioner over the researcher as the end user. Does that make sense? Let me say it again. They privilege the practitioner over the researcher as an end user of research. Practices are the place the teacher begins. And second, practices help us to identify what we do that simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. So it's really quite acceptable, even desirable, to refute or disconfirm a recommended practice when the research is damning. So it's really important to understand that nuance, that just because it says recommended practice in front of it doesn't mean that's so. It just means somebody recommended it. So let's move along this continuum and understand where we are. Now that we've got the base. Does the base make sense to you? It's the stuff we're told to do. Is that stuff good, bad, or indifferent, or have we no idea? Now, the mid-level position in the pyramid continuum is held by best practices, and it's really on best practices that most of our hopes in gifted education are going to be hung right now. And the term is ubiquitous in education. I just happened to do a Google search because it's such a sharp inquiry tool. I did a Google search of the term best practices in education, and it resulted in a whopping 133 million hits. Okay, let me say that again. Now I know Google searching is, a low-level form of research, but 133 million. Okay, when I delimited that a little bit, a Google search of best practices in gifted education resulted in a respectable 571,000, a little over 500,000, inching on up towards 600,000. So if that's the case, then what does best practice mean? Well, the evidence supporting a best practice is more stringent. Let me see here. It represents consensus. That doesn't mean that everybody has to get along, but there are enough people in the room who will nod their heads when you state the practice that you can gain some consensus. Another characteristic of a best practice is that it is indeed informed by research, but you can define that in this way. Might be field studies, might be case studies, might be surveys, might be randomized controls, any way that we're looking at empirical evidence. Might be quantitative, might be qualitative. It's also informed by clinical practice for the clinicians in here, and it also includes the experience, the lessons from experienced professionals are acceptable forms of evidence to support best practices. So it's a broader range of evidence that we can look at here than the one that we're going to look at last, the evidence-based. So when we looked more recently, you can find, the reason I'm flipping this up here is you can find it in a book, and the book's been translated and it might be helpful to you, but that's not why I'm getting it up here. What's in here, however, is what got the blue ribbon of best when we looked about 7 or 8 years ago. You have to look at things about every decade or you kind of lose your grounding. We did have a systematic process, and I'd like not to go through it step by step, but just to let you know it was systematic, and I'm going to Zoom, it involved both practitioners and researchers. You know, Margaret gave a good example of that in her keynote about a collaborative. This worked in some sense that way. But what I would like to do is jump to the bottom bullets there and say that once you look at the research, if you really want to translate something for practitioners to consume, you have to craft a story. You can't just do research result after result after result. There has to be a story in there because at a very deep level, human beings learn by stories. I'm not saying that just because I'm a former English teacher either. It's a very deep form of learning. And you also have to provide some example actions for people to take in order to be able to do something. So in any event, when we moved from recommended practices to ones that were more stringently supported, we fetched up with, and this is a primary source document to show the old original chart, we fetched up with 29. So we went from 101 to 29, right? And some of them were relevant to the home, some of them were more classroom-based, and some of them were school-based. Home had about 8, classroom about 11, and school about 10, so that ought to add up to around 29. And from those 29, I'm going to share some examples this morning. So here's one. These are the ones I'm going to have time to share, except I've probably compacting out of the remarks because I don't want to rush us. So let me do this. It's quite a flap in North American discussions right now. But an example of a practice that withstood the scrutiny of the team of researchers in the U.S. Department of Education, individuals who looked at these 29 practices, and we were funded by the U.S. Department of Ed to do this. One of them that stood the scrutiny was developing specific talents. And this is a practice we associated with the home rather than the school, that was because of the research that was available at the time and then the way we searched it. So I'm going to read the practice because I want you to hear the language about it. I won't insult you by reading frequently, but I want you to hear it. That's why there are quotation marks around it. Talent development is a complex process. This is the story. It's at this level, the story, that you've got to put things. Talent development is a complex process involving the individual, the home, the school, and the community. Research on talented adults has been used to understand the process in specific domains. Talent development in children is influenced by parents' response to the talent and by the response of others in the family or community when the family environment is not optimal. In addition, talent development, you won't see this on the screen. That's just ... In addition, talent development is fostered when the child or adolescent encounters the right teacher at the right time and has the opportunity to connect powerfully with the talent area and has an outlet to express accomplishment. Okay? So that's the story. Behind that story is quite a bit of research, but you can capture it in a story form. So when you have something like that, then what are you supposed to do that will help us decide this practice is successfully best? In other words, someone will do something about it. Well, here are a couple of examples. These are specific actions that are justifiable based on the story of the research. Here's one for parents, and here's one for educators. Understand that a child may identify, and do not become alarmed. Those sound like they're internal, but they're actually actions, aren't they? Because you're shifting your thinking. For educators, here's one, take an action. Children and adolescents need outlets to try out. Now so in a nutshell then, when you look at this, when you look at the story and you look at the practice, a child developing a specific talent may want and need a venue or an audience. Now there's nothing in this practice or in the research supporting it that says all talented children must have a public hearing, only that an outlet fostered at home or at school can help. That's what it says, all right? It's not telling you must run right out into the street and get an audience for every child who wishes to tap dance or show their science. It's not what it's saying. Okay. So that's we found it most powerfully at the home. Research that had to do about family ability and community ability to develop talent, but it does involve the school as well. So let's move to some practices we found. Yeah, you weren't going to get away without this because this is one of my favorite practices, and I even brought a visual to demonstrate. So let's move to practices that tend to focus here. They tend to focus on instruction in subject areas, math, science, social studies. They will focus on instructional approaches like inquiry. Now, these are best practices, so remember what best practices means then. Means it's supported, doesn't it? Are we all in agreement on that? I have to check because not everybody, it takes me 2 or 3 cups of coffee in the morning to wake up, so I don't know how this works for you. And then there are also instructional management practices like flexible grouping or compacting that fall into the classroom-focused best practices that would get a medal or a ribbon if we were handing those out. So primary sources I love, and I will not read it to you here because you can see it, but you know that a primary source is a document that you can use in the classroom that occurred at the time that you're wanting to teach something. It's usually used in history, but not always. And I want to ask the question, how many of you have made it to the Hans Christian Andersen Museum? I do want to see a show of hands. I'm teaching here, okay? All right. If you haven't, run right out. Wait until I'm done, but then run right out. And if you have, then you know what you saw was a universe of primary source material that could be used in the classroom. Those of you who saw that Hans Christian Andersen did not only fairy tales, but exquisite paper cutting as art, this is a primary source because this is a facsimile of one of his paper cuts, and it's at the same size and displayed in the same color. So it's not a representation, a poster of it. It's really a primary source that you can use in the classroom. Actually, you don't have to go to the museum to do it. In fact, they have such fabulous digitized resources, you can call them up wherever your classroom is. But here's what we know about this practice. We know this. If you don't teach it explicitly, even talented adolescents cannot think and write from primary source documents, and that's what historians do. If they can operate from one and kind of summarize it, but they tend not to know what to do when they conflict. And every piece of historical evidence will have more than one perspective. So they have trouble doing that. You have to teach that explicitly. And you have to explicitly teach them how to corroborate evidence, how to source it, who said it, and what does that tell me, and how to contextualize documents. And contextualization is really a strong point of the Hans Christian Andersen Museum over there. They've done a beautiful job with it. So here are some specific actions you can take. Provide open-ended problems. Increase the opportunity for writing from primary documents, because it's not the same kind of writing that students are asked to do when they're asked to write from imagination solely without a referent, although primary source writing and historical writing can be very imaginative. And equip history classrooms with adequate access to primary documents. You know, that used to be tough. Now it is so easy. I can import, because everything's been digitized, I can take the rich resources that are online, not 5 minutes from where we're sitting and standing in the Hans Christian Andersen archive, and whether my classroom is in Brazil, or whether it's in Iceland, whether it's in Little Rock, Arkansas, USA, whether it's in Ghana, I can call it all up, and I can work with it. So, it's a world of imagination. Now, I'm just going to make a sidebar comment about this. When we first looked at this set of research, which again, saying you should look about every 10 years if you want to keep your sanity, we looked at this about 7 years ago. The practice that was research-based was largely focused on secondary students, and it was largely focused on history. If we look again, and we're going to look again in about 2 years, I think what we're going to find are two trends. One, we're going to find that the practice has been, younger and younger children have been given the opportunity. We understand more about how to work with these primary source documents in the classroom, and it's certainly no longer used only in history. Rhetoric and writing uses verbal and nonverbal primary source documents in its best practice. It's used in the arts, it's used in biography, and it's used differently in science, but it's used there as well. So what's happened here is digitization has actually widened the curricular scope of the practice as well as increased accessibility to all of us. So you can't do better than that, can you? Okay, last thing in terms of best practices. Let's look at one. I'm sticking this one in. I chose this one out of all the others I could have focused on because this is one of Bruce Shore's favorites among the best practices. So here's how he characterized it. And he has his own sentence structure, so let me interpret a little bit here. Career education is a potentially valuable part of the curriculum for gifted children, and in many ways uniquely so. It's highly valued by students. We've got some studies that show how much they value it. They value it almost more than anything else. And it may help them navigate an adolescence that's burdened by inadequate knowledge about the world of work, burdened by an inadequate knowledge about their own needs, burdened by their multi-potentiality, or simply not knowing about interesting occupations they're not encountering at home or in school. And he then goes on to be sure, it's delimited later, this practice, that career education is different from career choice. So here's some specific actions. I removed this slide, but I'm going to give them to you quickly, verbally. Have students reflect on themselves and imagine future roles and keep logs. Read biographies of eminent people in different career paths, analyzing how their eminence arose and the different ways they coped with their uniqueness. I didn't say that. Joyce Van Tassel-Basket did, but I heartily endorse what she said. Incorporate discussions, and I think this is an important specific action you can take derived from this particular best practice. Incorporate discussions in extracurricular clubs outside the formal curriculum in a context that will help female, culturally diverse, or low-income students for whom the classroom may be perceived as a barrier. It may help them to the full expression of their career aspiration or potential. All right? So now, and an interesting sidebar, I think, about best practices. That's the middle part of our continuum here, is that in comparison to what we saw a decade and a half earlier with the 101 recommended practices, you're able to map a shift in the field's research and practice preoccupations. So whereas instructional and curriculum practices in key subject matter areas were quite weakly represented among the 101 practices, they did appear strongly among the set of 29. I think that's interesting. And in many cases, or in several cases, they were well supported by well-designed school intervention and field studies. So we saw more instruction and more curricular practices among those that met the criteria of best than we gleaned previously from the advice that had been handed out earlier as recommended. Hey, that's nice, right? So let's keep moving toward the top of the pyramid because I want to look at some contested ground here. I'm aware of it. The third and most rigorously supported practices we'll consider this morning are evidence-based practices. And let's shorten that to EBP, evidence-based practices. This lens first emerged out of medicine and then was adopted by the social sciences, including education. And I always appreciate the human story behind this kind of work. So here are two individuals whose vision was crucial to the EBP movement. Archie Cochrane, who's a Scots physician, and with a commitment to health care, because this concept of evidence-based practice came out of medicine. And Donald Campbell, who is basically a theorizing psychologist who found himself as it's wonderful. He's often called an accidental evaluator of social programs, including educational programs. He was really a theorist, but he found himself doing practical work. Must have shocked the daylights out of him. Anyway, these two gentlemen, and you can see by their birth and death dates, neither of them founded the collaborations that are in existence today that do this kind of work. Instead, their work inspired the founding. It's pretty hard for Dr. Cochrane to have founded the Cochrane collaboration in 1993 when he was already considering evidence-based practices from another perspective, you know? So how many folks, don't have to raise your hand, I won't do that teacher thing to you, but just kind of nod your head if you've encountered either the Cochrane or Campbell collaboration or had some, okay, good, because there is actually, in terms of the Campbell collaboration, there is a very active Nordic Campbell collaboration based out of Copenhagen. So it gets around, so to speak. Now, I want to talk just a moment about these because this is, I said, at the top of the pyramid. And how did it get there? All right. These collaboratives encourage independent researchers to aggregate individual research studies on a particular practice. They're all about practice. That's because policymakers asked them to check if money was being spent on things that made a difference. That's the bottom line, sad to say. So it developed in medicine, which means they're interested in doing no harm. We adopted it in the social sciences in collaboration in the name of Donald Campbell. And they do privilege randomized controlled trials as the gold standard. That is true, they do. That will be part of the medical heritage, because remember, first, do no harm. You've got to see what's going on. But the most important thing for us, I think, because not all of us have the privilege of doing randomized field studies in our domains, is that they utilize systematic review, which means that they have to be transparent about what they're doing and be able to explain it to other people. Recently, they've accepted quasi-experimental, so all of the kinds of things that aren't exactly randomized count. And it is indeed the most stringent level of research evidence applied to policy and practice. We can say that. It is much smaller and at the top of a pyramid. So that looks like a pretty rigorous set of criteria to think about, isn't it? Does that make you wonder, do we have any of those? Is there anything that would meet at the top of the pyramid? You might be asking yourself that. In terms of educating talented children and adolescents, is there anything that might be elevated level? Well, yes, there is. And now, before I flip the slide here, you might try to think to yourself of which of the practices that you know of or that I've talked about this morning might reach that elevated level. One of the things that happens is that evidence-based practices are characterized by the existence of those systematic reviews of research. And one indicator of whether or not a gifted education practice has been this is whether or not we've got any meta-analytic analyses existing in the field. That's a quantitative study of studies using the same estimators in order to combine and compare results. And we have meta-analysts right in this room. And if you've been reading, every doctoral student in the world hopes to encounter a meta-analysis, I'll get it right, a meta-analysis, or no, I won't, while they're doing the review of research in order to propose their doctoral studies. But in any event, do we have any of those? I mean, have we got anything that would hit this kind of rigorous level of a practice? Want to hypothesize? You have a theory about? Well, yeah, we do. Isn't that nice? Yes, we do. So you can think about it, and I'm just going to mention two and show you some things that came from it. It's already been here, and I know it's contested in many ways, but hey, acceleration is an example of a practice that has reached EBP. More than one meta-analysis by more than one set of researchers, so you can't nail people for bias in the extreme, conducted across more than one decade. And they lead us to evidence-based practices. So I have to be brief this morning, but there was a number of excellent sessions in your program about this. Susan Asseline talked about the practices. There are 20 of them. There are a family of them, not a single thing. Lori Croft talked about how to use the advocacy message. Katie McCluskey talked about the boost acceleration gives to people in adulthood. There's been a lot of discussion. And I also know, and I'm well aware, that we often think about this as a uniquely North American fascination in terms of practice, but Leanne Hugeveen in A Nation Empowered looked at how Europe was handling acceleration and found various examples of where it was being used in a number of nations in a number of different forms. So it's broadening, and Australia uses it as well. So it's cross-country if it's not global. So would there be anything else? If this doesn't happen to be your brand new bag, could there be any other things? We get time for one more. And because it's a lovely day, I'm going to eschew flexible grouping, which is going to make it into EBP, if it hasn't already. And instead, I'm going to pull up one that comes out of this work. The top 20 principles from psychology for pre-K-12 teaching and learning. I know Jonathan Plucker took this particular practice on. There's one in here that says, encouraging or fostering creativity is sufficiently evidence-based. When we looked at it 7 years ago, it was certainly in the best practices category. It wouldn't be evidence-based, but I think ultimately it will get there. And what happened here is a group of psychologists or researchers, a little bit more diverse than psychologists, looked at psychological research and decided, well, are there some principles that we could pull out, the top 20? They didn't go for the top 10. Possibly that's because they couldn't agree on the top 10, but they went for the top 20 and gave us a richer set. And they did it deductively. They looked at research. They looked at theory. They were informed by theory. They looked at research, and then they derived practices. So that's top down. That's theory, research, practice. And they found one. They were looking generally, not simply for talented students or to develop talents, but they found one. And the principle was student creativity can be fostered. So simply stated, don't you think? So simply stated. And then they derived some specific actions. And I picked these two because I would challenge any educator in the room, that would include us, whether we're teaching K or whether we're teaching graduate school, not to be able to do this. And without devoting a lot of time. You can simply allow a wide range of student approaches to completing a task, because the way you're telling a student to do it might be most optimal for them, but might not be. And secondly, and this gladdens the heart of anybody who's been a literacy or interested in literacy, you can simply modify the language in your assignment, and we all give assignments. All educators give assignments. Even in kindergarten, you give an assignment because little kids have to think about something and then tell you. So if you have in that prompt verbs like create, invent, discover, imagine if, and predict, that increases creativity however defined, okay? The reason this one is not quite at EBP yet is because those meta-analyses that have been done are not all using the same sets of variables, so they're a little bit more diverse, all right? Isn't this good news? This is nice news, isn't it? Because that takes it down to the level of practice, but it's nicely done out of theory and research. So we really can feel good about that. So there's your pyramid. We started with recommended, which may have meant only one person recommended it, and it might have been crummy advice or very good advice. We got to best, where we could get some consensus, and then we fetched up at the top of the pyramid there, where the air is pretty rarefied. But we ought not to let that scare us off. Because one of the other things I think we ought to talk about, but we don't get to this morning, because I know better than to stand between you and your morning buffet, is that practices can be global. We might be able to, clearly, they might be able to be generalized wherever we are. They can be contextual, in which the geography, the culture, the nation identification might mean that they're going to be implemented in different ways. And what did we do? How did we anoint a practice best? What made us decide? Where's our field now? What makes us, we unpacked to decide what a practice was best rather than bad, or best rather than recommended, or best rather than evidence-based. We went for the middle of the pyramid. This is where most, whoa, I don't want to go there. This is where most, I really don't. This is where most of our practices are. They're in the middle. We've plumped for moderation, because what we've done is we've looked for research, but we've included clinical insights, we've included practitioner experience as credible evidence, and we've allowed for both inductive and deductive approaches. So to turn research into practice, or to let practice inform the most urgently needed research, that's how we've gone about it. Second thing we did this morning is we identified some example practices that earned that badge of best, the medal or the ribbon. And that's nice news, because they're all sufficiently validated that we can in good conscience proceed with them. It'd be the best thing to do. Best practices be the best thing we can do right now. And perhaps some of the links that I flashed up here this morning might have you follow your distinct interests in some of these practices, because we can't cover them in a short time. And we want to do that so we can close the research to practice gap. Or was that the practice to research gap? Flip it on its head occasionally. I think you'll enjoy the view from upside down. So thank you very much. I'm not sure that we have time to take questions, but I will, and if we don't, I'll be out there having coffee. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne. And you came as advertised, and you've really gave us a lot of valuable information and a lot to think about in terms of closing the very real gap.
It's very real.
Between research and practice, so thank you.
Real.
I think we do have time. Anne said she'll hang around after if people want to come up, but maybe time for, say, 2 quick questions. Any questions out there?
There's someone in there. Can you shout out?
There's one at the back, of course, at the very back.
Yeah. Can you shout out?
Just the mic's on the way to you. Hang on.
Of course, because she's been at the business of meta-analysis for quite a while, so it's very handy. I want to thank her personally, even though I know she's not here, but sure, and changed over time. And she's done meta-analyses on more than one thing, so believe me, those meta-analyses are like gold if you can get them. So they also have varying quality, but they're like gold if you can get them. Anybody else have a question? Now, you really want that coffee and cake. Oh, no, is it coffee and fruit this morning? Aye? All right. Be sure in 2 years you come to Australia, because it would be very fun to see you again. So thank you so much. It was great.